the sound of heavy breathing. I've never been afraid of being alone. Some people can't handle the isolation, the creaks and groans of an old house settling at night, but that stuff never bothered me. I live by myself in a small two-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood. No kids, no roommates, no nonsense. Just me and the occasional Netflix binge after a long day of work. Peace and quiet were something I valued. Then the breathing started. It was subtle at first, so quiet I thought I imagined it. One night as I lay in bed scrolling through my phone, I heard it, a slow, rhythmic sound, almost like the wind whistling through the cracks in the window frame. I didn't pay much attention to it at the time. It wasn't anything particularly out of the ordinary, and honestly, my mind was half asleep. I wrote it off as the house settling or maybe even the plumbing. Whatever it wasn't enough to concern me. But as the days passed, the sound persisted, and I noticed it more and more. It only happened late at night, usually after midnight, when the house was quiet and still. At first, it came in short bursts, barely audible, but soon it became louder, more defined. It wasn't the wind, I realized. It was something else, something alive, heavy, deep, breathing. I told myself it was all in my head. That's the first thing you do when weird stuff happens, right? You try to rationalize it. Maybe the air ducts were rattling, or some animal had gotten into the attic. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. One night, the breathing became unmistakable. It wasn't faint or subtle anymore. It was there, clear as day, like someone standing just behind my bedroom door. The slow inhale, the long exhale, over and over again. I shot up in bed, my heart pounding. I listened, straining my ears. There it was again, louder now. My eyes darted around the dark room, half expecting to see someone standing in the corner watching me. But the room was empty, completely empty. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, sweeping the beam across every inch of the room. Nothing. The breathing continued, slow and deliberate. I tried to calm myself. I wasn't the type to jump at shadows, but this was different. It was too real. I crept out of bed and checked the door, turning the handle slowly. It didn't make a sound as I opened it. The hallway was empty, of course. My stomach knotted, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I stood there holding my breath, listening. The breathing had stopped. I exhaled and chuckled, trying to make light of the situation. "You're losing it," I muttered to myself, shaking my head. I chalked it up to stress or maybe a dream that felt too real. I convinced myself there was nothing to worry about, and eventually I managed to fall back asleep. But the next night, it happened again, and the next. Every night, around the same time, I would hear it. Always faint at first, like it was somewhere far off in the distance, but it would grow louder, closer, until it seemed like it was right next to me. The worst part, no matter where I was, whether in my bedroom, the living room, or the kitchen, it felt like the breathing was following me, always just out of sight. I started losing sleep, staying up later, waiting for it to start. It became a nightly ritual, sitting in bed with my back against the headboard, clutching my phone and staring at the door. Waiting, listening. I couldn't explain it, and I didn't tell anyone about it either. I mean, who would believe me? "Oh, I'm hearing heavy breathing in my house at night." Yeah, that would go over well. One night, I snapped. I'd had enough of feeling like I was being haunted by some invisible force. I couldn't take it anymore. The breathing had become louder, more aggressive, like whoever or whatever was doing it was right behind me, breathing down my neck. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and walked through the house, room by room, turning on every light as I went. My heart pounded in my chest, and my pulse thrummed in my ears, but I was determined to find the source. I wasn't crazy. I couldn't be. I checked the bedroom, the bathroom, the guest room. Nothing. The living room, the closets, even the basement. No sign of anyone or anything. The breathing had stopped, but I could still feel it. That oppressive sense of being watched, of not being alone. When I returned to the bedroom, I froze. The bed. There was something under the bed. It was subtle, just the faintest sound, but I heard it. Breathing. Slow, deep breathing, like something was hiding beneath the mattress, waiting for me. I gripped the knife tighter, sweat trickling down my forehead. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. I stood there, paralyzed, staring at the bed. The breathing grew louder, more pronounced, as if whatever was down there knew I was hesitating. I had to know. I had to see. With shaking hands, I crouched down and peered beneath the bed. The darkness was thick, suffocating, but I could just make out a shape, a figure, curled up in the shadows. The breathing was coming from it. I scrambled back, heart racing, bile rising in my throat. I backed up against the wall, trying to comprehend what I had just seen. It wasn't possible. Nothing had been in the house when I searched. I couldn't have missed something like that, and yet the breathing continued. I did the only thing I could think of. I ran. I fled the house, knife still in hand, and drove to the nearest motel. I spent the night there, wide awake. The image of that thing under the bed burned into my mind. But even as I sat there in the cheap, sterile room, I heard it, that same slow, heavy breathing. It followed me. No matter where I go, I can hear it now, always just behind me, always there, breathing. I'm afraid to sleep, afraid to close my eyes, because I know, deep down, it's not a sound from outside. The breathing is coming from inside me. The girl on the shore. I've lived by the ocean all my life. The small fishing town where I grew up isn't much to look at. Just a handful of cottages, a few old shops, and a harbor that smells perpetually of salt and fish. Most people pass through without a second glance, but for me, the coast is home. There's a certain peace in the rhythm of the waves, the quiet that settles over the town at night when the boats have docked, and the only sound is the water lapping at the shore. But lately, that peace has been broken. It started about a month ago, during one of those storms that sweep in from the sea without warning. The rain was coming down hard, and the wind howled through the cracks in my window frame. But something else caught my attention. A figure standing out by the shore. At first I thought it was one of the local kids, maybe out on some stupid dare. But as I squinted through the sheets of rain, I realized it was a girl. A young girl, maybe 10 or 12, just standing there staring out at the sea. It was late, past midnight, and the storm was in full force, so naturally I was worried. I grabbed my coat and ran outside, calling out to her as I hurried down the path toward the beach. But by the time I reached the shore, she was gone, just vanished into thin air. I stood there drenched and confused, scanning the beach for any sign of her. But there was nothing, no footprints, no movement. The waves crashed violently against the rocks, but the girl had disappeared as if she'd never been there in the first place. The next day, I asked around town, wondering if anyone else had seen her. No one had. People chalked it up to the storm playing tricks on me, or maybe I'd seen one of the neighborhood kids running home in the rain. But I knew what I saw. That girl was real, and the way she had just vanished, it left a knot of unease in my chest that I couldn't shake. I didn't see her again for a few days, and I started to think maybe they were right. Maybe it had been a trick of the light or the rain messing with my head. But then, one evening, just as the sun was setting, I saw her again. She was standing in the same spot, right by the water's edge, her back to me, as she stared out at the horizon. This time, the sea was calm, the sky painted in hues of pink and orange, and there was no reason for her to be out there alone. I watched her for a long time, trying to make sense of it. Something about the way she stood perfectly still made my skin crawl. There was something unnatural about it, like she wasn't really there. I called out to her again, but she didn't move, didn't even flinch. I started walking toward her, but before I could get close, a fog rolled in, thick and fast. Within seconds, it swallowed the shore, and by the time I reached the spot where she had been standing, she was gone. Again. The same thing happened the next time, and the time after that. Always the same. The girl standing by the shore, never looking at me, always disappearing before I could reach her. It was starting to drive me mad. Who was she? Where did she go? Why was she always there in the same spot, like she was waiting for something or someone? I couldn't stop thinking about her. I'd find myself staring out at the sea, waiting for her to appear. Sometimes I'd walk along the beach, hoping to catch a glimpse of her from a distance, but she only ever showed up when I was alone. It wasn't just her presence that disturbed me, though. It was what started happening after I saw her. Dead fish began washing up on the shore in alarming numbers, far more than usual and in strange patterns, like they had been arranged there deliberately. The sea grew unnaturally still whenever she appeared, the waves barely lapping against the shore, as if something was holding them back. Then there were the whispers. At night, when I was lying in bed, I'd hear them, faint, just at the edge of hearing, like the distant hum of the sea, but with words. Words I couldn't quite make out, but they were there, murmuring to me from the darkness. I wasn't sleeping much anymore. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. One evening, I decided to ask Old Man Fisher about the girl. He'd lived in the town longer than anyone and knew more about its history than most. I found him sitting on his porch, smoking his usual pipe, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Hey, Fisher," I said, trying to sound casual. "You ever see a girl standing down by the shore? About yay-high, dark hair?" He didn't answer right away, just kept puffing on his pipe, his eyes narrowing slightly. Finally, he glanced over at me. "A girl, you say?" His voice was rough like sandpaper. "You see her often?" "Yeah, last few weeks. She's always in the same spot by the water, but she disappears before I can reach her." Fisher's expression darkened. He took a long drag from his pipe, then exhaled slowly, as if weighing his words. "That's not a girl, son. Not anymore." My stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" He tapped the edge of his pipe against the porch railing, knocking out the ash. "Years ago, long before your time, there was a girl who drowned out there, got caught in a riptide, swept out to sea. They never found her body." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. "People say she still walks the shore," Fisher continued, his voice low, "looking for a way back. But she's not looking for help. She's looking for someone to take her place." I laughed, but it was forced. "Come on, that's just an old story, right?" Fisher didn't smile. "You keep seeing her, and you'll find out." I left his house feeling worse than I had before. His words played over and over in my head. Not a girl anymore. I didn't want to believe it, but I couldn't deny that something wasn't right. That night, I saw her again. This time, I didn't just watch from afar. I walked straight down to the shore, determined to confront her, to put an end to whatever this was. As I got closer, the air grew cold, unnaturally so. The sea was unnervingly calm, the waves barely a whisper against the sand. And there she was, standing with her back to me, her hair billowing gently in the wind that I couldn't feel. "Who are you?" I called out, my voice shaking despite my attempt to sound firm. She didn't answer, didn't turn around, just kept staring out at the sea. I took another step, then another, until I was only a few feet behind her. I reached out, my hand trembling, ready to tap her shoulder. Suddenly she turned, her face. It wasn't the face of a girl. Her eyes were black, empty voids, and her skin was pale, waterlogged, like she had been submerged for days. Her lips twisted into a grotesque smile, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. When she spoke, her voice was like the rush of water filling my ears. "Come with me." The last thing I remember is the sound of the waves crashing over me, dragging me under. Now I walk the shore, waiting for someone to take my place. The locked door. Moving into a new house always comes with its quirks. Little things that don't quite make sense, a bit of wear and tear, the odd creak in the night. I expected that when I bought the old house at the edge of town. It was a bit run down, sure, but it had charm, exposed beams, original hardwood floors, all that. And I got it for a steal. The old woman who sold it to me had lived there for decades. But after her husband passed, she didn't want to stay. "Too many memories," she said. What she didn't say, however, was anything about the door in the basement. I found it on my first day in the house. I had been moving boxes down to the basement, a dark, damp space with crumbling stone walls and a low ceiling. It was cluttered with junk, most of it stuff the old woman had left behind, and the air was thick with dust. But what caught my eye immediately was the door at the far end of the room. It was an ugly, heavy thing, reinforced with thick metal bolts and chains wrapped around it. The wood was old and splintered, but someone had gone to great lengths to secure it. 3 padlocks hung from the chains, each one rusted but intact. I frowned, walking closer. Why would anyone need a door like this in a basement? It looked more like something you'd see in a prison or a bank vault. I reached out, running my hand over the cold metal of the chains, trying to puzzle it out. That's when I saw the note. It was pinned to the door with a rusty nail, A single piece of yellowed paper with shaky handwriting scrawled across it. Do not open. That was it. No explanation. Just those 3 words in a script that I assumed belonged to the old woman. I chuckled nervously. It felt like something out of a horror movie. A locked door in the basement, an ominous note, classic setup, but I wasn't superstitious. And I certainly wasn't scared of a locked door. Still, the whole thing gnawed at me. Why lock it up so thoroughly? I hadn't noticed anything in the house's paperwork about a sealed-off room or any mention of it during the inspection. I wondered if it was an old storage space or maybe just an area the previous owners hadn't used in years. But why all the chains? For a few days I let it be. I told myself I'd get around to it eventually, that I had more important things to deal with, like unpacking and getting settled in. But every time I went down to the basement, the door was there, looming at the edge of my vision, drawing my attention no matter how hard I tried to ignore it. And then the noises started. It was late one night, maybe a week after I moved in. I was lying in bed when I heard a faint sound, something like scratching coming from below. I sat up, listening carefully, but the sound stopped. Thinking it might have been a mouse or some other animal in the walls, I brushed it off and tried to go back to sleep. The next night, I heard it again. This time it was louder, scratching, followed by a low, almost inaudible rumble. I couldn't place it. It wasn't the pipes or the wind. It sounded alive. I grabbed a flashlight and headed down to the basement, my heart pounding as I descended the creaky wooden steps. The air down there was colder than usual, and the beam of my flashlight flickered as I scanned the room. My eyes fell on the door, and for a moment I thought I saw the chains tremble. Just a small movement, but enough to send a shiver up my spine. I took a step closer, shining the light on the padlocks. They looked undisturbed, rusted, and old as ever, but the scratching sound continued, coming from behind the door. I froze. No way. I knelt down, pressing my ear against the cold wood. The sound was faint but unmistakable. Something was behind the door. Suddenly there was a thud, loud enough to make me jump back, nearly dropping the flashlight. My pulse raced. I wasn't imagining it. There was definitely something, or someone, behind that door. I rushed back upstairs, trying to calm myself down. It had to be an animal. Maybe a raccoon had gotten stuck in a crawl space behind the door. That made sense. Logical. I could deal with that. But why the chains? And why would someone leave a note like that for an animal? For days I tried to ignore it, but the noises kept coming. Scratches, thumps, even what sounded like a faint moan one night. Each time it grew louder, more persistent, and each time I felt that nagging urge to open the door. I couldn't help it. It became an obsession. Every night I would go down to the basement, standing in front of the door, wondering what was behind it. I'd run my fingers over the locks, almost daring myself to break them. The note hung there, taunting me. Do not open. But why? What could be so bad that it needed to be locked away like this? The more I thought about it, the more irrational it seemed. Curiosity gnawed at me until I couldn't take it anymore. One night, I snapped. I had to know. I grabbed a pair of bolt cutters from the garage and headed down to the basement. My hands were trembling as I approached the door, but I was determined. I didn't care what was behind it. I just needed to see. With a loud snap, the first padlock broke. The second and third followed quickly, the chains slipping free and clattering to the floor. I hesitated for a moment, staring at the now unlocked door. What was I doing? This was stupid. The note was probably just there to scare off intruders, right? There couldn't be anything dangerous behind a door in my own house. But something deep inside me screamed to stop. I ignored it. Taking a deep breath, I reached for the handle and pulled. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into the darkness below. A cold draft hit me in the face, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and something else. Something foul, like rotting meat. I gagged but stepped forward, shining my flashlight down the steps. The beam barely penetrated the darkness, but I could make out rough stone walls and a dirt floor at the bottom of the stairs. What the hell was this? I descended slowly, my footsteps echoing in the enclosed space. The air grew colder the further I went, and the smell worsened, thick and nauseating. When I reached the bottom, the beam of my flashlight fell on something that made my blood run cold. In the center of the room was an altar, crude, covered in dried blood and surrounded by bones. Human bones. They were arranged in strange patterns on the floor, circling the altar in a way that made my stomach twist. And then I saw it. In the far corner of the room, hunched over and motionless, was a figure. It was made of bone and sinew, twisted into a grotesque parody of a human form. Its head lolled to the side, and its limbs were long and thin, like something out of a nightmare. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. My flashlight flickered, and for a split second, the figure's head moved. Just a slight twitch, but enough to make me turn and bolt up the stairs. The door slammed shut behind me as I reached the top, the locks snapping back into place as if they had never been broken. I stood there panting, staring at the sealed door, too terrified to move. And I don't know what I let out that night, but I can still hear it. Every night from the other side of the door, it's getting louder.